Hi, welcome to this video. Today I wanted to reflect on some questions and readings, which really kind of speak to where I'm at in this process of this exploration of my project with the Garrison Fellowship. So I recorded some videos for this series on decentralized spirituality, and where those wrapped up was more in a place of personal inquiry rather than theory. And as I was pulling Corbin's book, Avicenna and the Visionary Recital, off the shelf today, I came across a passage that spoke to where I'm at on this inquiry. So I'll share a little bit about that with you. So with this inquiry around decentralized spirituality, part of what I was exploring was the relationship between the individual and the institution. And Corbin addresses that. So I'll just read directly. This is from page 269. So he writes, one matter remains to be mentioned, bearing on the connection between angelology and process of individuation. So this is really what so much of what I've been exploring is, what is the relationship between the person, the individual, and the divine, particularly as mediated by this relationship with the ally. So Corbin writes, we refer, so the matter he's talking about, he says, we refer to the fundamental opposition that our investigators, and by investigators he means, I think, these mystics like Avicenna. We refer to the fundamental opposition that our investigators have brought out between the religion of the Fedeli d'Amore and the official Christianity of the church. So Corbin connects the explorations of these Persian mystics to the explorations of these Italian poets, such as Dante, who were in deep personal relationship with the divine feminine. So basically, he's saying there's a conflict between those Fedeli d'Amore and the official church. And so this ties back into some of my questions around what's the relationship between the person as the site of divinity and how that is integrated or isn't integrated with the institutions of religion. So Corbin writes, the mediation of the active intelligence as angel of knowledge, dator formarum, signifies an individual revelation. The mediation of the, I'm going to translate to my language, the mediation of the ally signifies an individual revelation. And he writes, each time renewed for each soul that becomes fit for it and conscious of it, a revelation that irradiates upon it the eternal forms or ideas of being and beings. So he's just saying that this relationship with this mediating form of the divine illuminates the person, the human, with those more archetypal divine forms of being. So it's sort of like the access to the divine is mediated by this ally figure. And he writes, thus we had occasion to recall how, according to the Avicennans and the Ishrakian of the Debestan, the adept who unites with the active intelligence, who is the angel Gabriel himself, also becomes, quote, the seal of prophecy and is raised to the same level as the prophet, receiving the revelation of the angel Gabriel. So this is very, deep religiously oriented language that is orienting us or reflecting what Jeffrey Raff talks about in this more, in his language, this more alchemical practice of the ally work. The angelic mediation, that is the very form necessary and each time unique of the revelation of the hidden and inaccessible deity. So it's basically like in this understanding, this apophatic understanding of the divine that's beyond all knowing. It's an experience of it is mediated through this angelic or ally form. And it's also a very personal and individualized revelation or experience. So again, this brings up the tension between the individual and the institutional, because what Corbin is writing or sharing from his studies is the really personal nature of our connection to the divine through this mediated relationship. The angelic mediation, that's the very form necessary and each time unique of the revelation of the hidden and inaccessible deity, completes a process of individuation. So this relationship with the ally is implicitly connected to our own personal path of growth, individuation, discovering who we are, our purpose. So back to the Corbin, the process of individuation that brings the self to the threshold of the trans-consciousness in which it receives the announcement of the true subject, capital S, who thinks it by individuating it and individuates it by thinking it. That is, by revealing it and revealing this revelation to it, parentheses, consciousness of its consciousness. So we won't go into all that. I mean, you can pause and replay it if you want. It's very, very dense, but I'll kind of like unpack it simply. In a sense, it's this sense of the divine knowing itself through our form. And so through this relationship with the ally or this mediating angel, angelic form, it's basically the structure by which the divine takes form as the human and then knows itself through this relationship to the mediating angelic form. So it's like this very, if you think about fractals and take fractals as this symbolic image of this dynamic, what Corbin's trying to express in language is something that is very relational and about resonances and harmonics and fractals, but it's the way that consciousness knows itself through this relationship of taking form in these various ways. and then reflecting back on itself in these various ways. So we don't have to get in this moment like crazy technical about parsing every word, but it's a really dense way through language that Corbin's trying to feel into some direct experience. So then he writes, and this is why the Fedeli d'Amore could profess the same cult for the same intelligent Sophia, he's talking about the divine feminine, yet at the same time could perceive its archetypal figure under the features of a figure that was each time another, unique for each unique. So again, it's this paradox or complexity of this shared unity that is revealed personally. There's a couple more long paragraphs here that I'll just continue on with. So here's where he gets into this sense of tension with the institution. So he says this individual and individuating mediation as irremissible function that angelology is this study or engagement with this angelic domain of being. So this relationship, this mediating relationship between the human and the angelic form or the ally, Corbin writes, quote, can be only an embarrassment and a danger whenever a church regards itself as possessing the, he italicizes the word the, as possessing the historico-collective revelation, capital R, and hence as repository and sole mediator for all alike of this same revelation that is wisdom. This is an amazing passage. He's basically saying when a church, when an institution decides that it's the sole holder and interpreter and guarder or protector of wisdom, of mediated wisdom or wisdom itself, of revelation, that's a problem. And it sees this individual relationship with the divine as a threat, as a danger, or even as potential embarrassment to its institution. So this is the beautiful tension that Corbin's pointing to, is that churches want to say, we are the only tellers of history, not you. Or even we are going to take wisdom and put it into a historical narrative and say we own this historical collective narrative. And so you better kind of like play by our rules, because otherwise you're essentially in opposition to us. Corbin goes on to say, inheriting in some sort the function of the active intelligence, perhaps the church likewise inherited its mystical image in feminine likeness. So I think Corbin's touching in on like these institutional forms, they do have this correlation to what they're trying to represent. And he says, quote, iconography would positively indicate this. So in the images of the church, whether it's angelic or divine images, there's this correspondence, this real connection to the divine. However, Corbin says, and yet in that case, despite all efforts to the contrary, I think he's saying despite all efforts for the church to say we own this narrative of the divine, he writes, quote, there can be no question of anything but an allegory in the proper sense of the term. An institution cannot replace a person. So this is, end quote, this is powerful. He's saying these institutions, these churches, all they hold for us are allegories and stories. They can't replace us. So the true site, the true institution is the person, is the human being. The church is just a location to tell stories, to remind us of what's true, to bring, how can the church point the narrative back to the person? Because it can't replace it. Again, I'll say it, an institution cannot replace a person. It's very liberative philosophy Corbin sharing with us. And this liberative dimension, it will keep emerging in these last paragraph and a half. So he writes, in the last analysis, this is perhaps the most distant perspective. And when I hear him saying distant perspective, I think he's like zooming out, looking at the big picture. Like, what's the big takeaway here? This is perhaps the most distant perspective that the Avicennan, so this 11th century philosopher Avicenna, that the Avicennan angelology, so Avicenna's study of this angelic dimension of being, that the Avicennan angelology would open for us. So what's this all about? What's this studying Avicenna and Corbin about? It's opening this perspective for us. And Corbin writes, the unique and necessary mediation that accomplished on the celestial plane between the divinity and the individual soul, the mediation on the celestial plane that happens between the divinity and the individual soul. So as Raff would say, the practice of ally work, what that does, and Corbin is saying it's both unique, very personal, and necessary. There's something, why, that's an interesting word. Why is this necessary? Why is our relationship to the divine necessary? And he goes on to say, quote, on the terrestrial plane, it frees the individual existence from all collective and institutional forms. This is powerful. This is like if Corbin was like a dude marching on the streets with this kind of philosophy, it would be a very interesting form of radicalism and liberative philosophy. He's saying that, to use Raff's language, this practice of ally work, this connecting or reuniting of the individual with the divine through this mediating figure, this mediating relationship. On the terrestrial plane, in our human form, in our human world, that relationship frees us from all collective and institutional forms. I'll just kind of, I think, just leave those words there because that's just a very powerful statement. Last paragraph. Brought close to one another in this community of cult and destiny, and please take that word cult very lightly. He's more talking about community of mystics in this sense. Brought close to one another in this community of cult and destiny, the faithful in love, that's what he's saying this cult or culture is, those of the West and those of Iran. So he's saying those poets, for example, of Italy, or more broadly, the mystics of the West and those of Iran, that community enable us better to distinguish at least the borders of the way upon which they all had entered. And he names them mystics, poets, and philosophers alike. So he's basically saying in this study, at least we're starting to orient ourselves. We're engaging in conversation and dialogue as part of a community of fellows, mystics, philosophers, poets, artists, scientists. And here he comes to a really interesting reflection. And I think something that I won't call it speaks to a place of stuckness that I'm at, but a place of inquiry. and maybe a place in which I'm trying to find a clarity or a formula or a reduction that maybe is not so easily achievable. So Corbin writes, shall we ask if the course of their way still has other than a historical meaning, a meaning for our historical present? And I love this passage. He's basically saying, like, does all this deep mysticism, this deep inquiry, this deep orientation to meaning, truth, the divine, the beloved, does it have any meaning for us in this time? Or is it just history? Are these just a bunch of people from the past that don't actually relate to our lives? So what's the answer to that question? He gives a very interesting response. He says, there is no general answer. There's no general answer. He says, there is no general answer or theoretical program for this type of question. And I think in a way that's where I'm in. This is the territory where I'm trying to navigate or orient myself. This question almost reminds me of the work of Bayo Akamalafe, in which Bayo is trying to point to the way that what he would call like late stage capitalism or this colonized landscape is by its nature conditioning us to respond to this question in formulaic or programmatic ways with general answers. And so Corbin here is saying, like Bayo perhaps, there is no general answer or theoretical program for this type of question. So what does he say next? Corbin writes, it is for each of us to decide it. He throws it back on us. It is for each of us to decide it by, quote, deciphering like Attar's birds. So this is a reference to one of Avicenna's stories. By deciphering like Attar's birds, the document of his own destiny, the private document of his soul. There's no general answer. It's up to each of us to examine our own destiny, our soul. Corbin writes, quote, a, quote, phenomenology of angelic consciousness had to show us what, in its own light, such a, quote, document can signify in the present. So I think Corbin's saying here that just like these stories of Avicenna's, these inspiring narratives, we are asked to turn to our own relationship to this angelic consciousness to shed light on what this can all mean for us in the present. And again, back to the Corbin quote, but there is no technical formula for provoking the encounter that befell Avicenna on the outskirts of the inner city of his soul, that is, on the threshold of subliminal consciousness. Corbin saying there's no formula to introduce us or to bring us to this threshold. Quote Corbin's, if ever the encounter befalls, it is for each to decide if he will reply as Avicenna replied to the invitation of his own High Ibn Yazkan. That's a name of this figure. You could say a mystical or angelic messenger form that Avicenna was in meeting with or relationship with. How will we reply to this invitation? It's up to us, he's saying, Corbin is saying. And Corbin writes, it's for each to decide if he will reply, he, she, they. It is each for decide if he will reply as Avicenna replied to the invitation of his own High Ibn Yas Khan, if he will do what will enable him to reply and to testify with Avicenna, quote, "Lo, we are on the road, we are journeying in company with the king's messenger." So Corbin is really framing this as, he could say in a very trauma-informed way, we receive an invitation, it's an invitation, and it's up to us to decide how to respond. There's no formula for provoking that invitation. And when that invitation arrives, it's up to us as to how to respond. And this is where I'm in the midst of a question mark, because part of my thinking had been to be seeing the practice that Jeffrey Raff is providing as a kind of algorithm, as a kind of formula. And maybe that's a mistake for me to explain it in that way, because maybe things can't be reduced to this programmatic or algorithmic as Corbin said, theoretical program. That's the question that I have. We can introduce folks to mindfulness in simple ways with mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques, for example, courses and classes. Can we do that in the same way with ally work? You know, Raff, I think, has written his books because he thinks that we can. He's providing these steps and these practices. And yet, how did I learn ally work? It was from a workshop with Raff. Was it the practices, or was it the context and the transmission or the introduction, so to speak, through Raff? That's in a sense been my deep question all along. You know, Raff says that every person with practice can come to know their ally if they really put in that effort and that dedication. And the question of mine is how important it is it for that context to be held by someone like Raff in the way that it was for me? And can it really, is it how reproducible can this, how accessible can this practice of ally work become? What are the conditions that precipitate that encounter, that relationship? And in this moment, it's really just holding that as a question feels of the moment for me. So thank you for listening and exploring these readings, reflections, and questions. I hope they were provocative and offered some value to you. Take care.